Greetings all. I am back and wanting to share some of what I see in the sky story at this full moon. We are moving through what I have come to think of as the most intense time period. Um, I don't want to say of my lifetime, because certainly we just went through COVID, but it is an incredibly intense time, very similar to moving through COVID. That is for me, at least, because the issue in the Middle East affects me. And I would argue that realistically, this issue affects all of us, given that America is so intertwined from a foreign policy perspective with what we see happening in the Middle East. And so I was thinking about creating or trying to create a transmission that sort of skirted around some of these issues, but hinted to them so that I sounded very diplomatic in how I was approaching it without actually naming what I was talking about. Astrologers often do that. It's like we want to speak to the energies, but not offend or upset anyone. And I was finding that it was very weird and difficult speaking that way. So what I'm going to do, I don't know that anything I'm going to say is going to be inflammatory. Actually, I think it will help us think from an evolutionary perspective, as has been the nature of my transmissions previously about this issue. But I want to name something specifically, primarily because the full moon axis that we're on and the story of this full moon requires that we do that. So let's take a look at the energies. I don't mind keeping myself sort of small here. Got a light behind me that makes it difficult to see me. And really, I want you to focus in on the chart. So there's actually a ton of chart elements that I'd like to speak to, some from the realm of the feminine and also from an evolutionary perspective. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is this Gemini Sagittarius axis. That's where the full moon is. Whenever we have a full moon, the moon is sitting opposite the sun, right? The sun is hitting the moon at full luminescence, the full size of the moon. And so that means the moon is in opposition to the sun. And so instead of just looking at one sign, we're looking at the whole axis and how the axis informs each other. And so this is what we would call the third ninth house axis. And what's funny in this chart is that these houses are flip-flop to each other. It just so happens to be laid out this way. And if you're not sure what houses are and what I'm speaking to, that's okay. I just wanted to mention that generally we think of Gemini as the natural third house and Sagittarius as the natural ninth house. And these two happen to be flip-flopped in this chart. So what is Gemini? Gemini is considered the natural third house. Like we said, Gemini is ruled by Mercury. If we looked at the chart in a natural layout, meaning Aries is the first house, when we get to Gemini, the third house, if we look at the chart as a map of development or human consciousness, we see that Gemini is that stage of development in which we are, for the first time, separating. So not separating as an adult, as in going off on our own, but generally the infant sees itself as attached to the mother, right? Until a certain period of development. And for the first time, they are discovering themselves as a distinct and separate person. And so this is where a lot of mental processes are coming online to help the individual on its journey of individuation. So ruled by Mercury, we know that this has a lot to do with the mind and the intellect and how images impress themselves on the mind. So Gemini is really important. Sorry, there's a siren outside. Yes, very alarming moment we're at, right? So Gemini rules and Mercury together, they both rule information, mentality. That's Mercury. It's like Mercury and in the in the Kabbalion or the seven Hermetic principles, we think of Mercury as being mind, and that first principle that all is mind, and that sort of harkens back to this idea of separating and discovering ourselves as distinct people. That really the mind is very strongly coming online. It's the age that language is developed. And so, Mercury in my cosmology rules the throat chakra. And so there's something here about communication and information, how information is spread, media, how we edit information, how information is put through specific lenses for us to understand it, or framing. Gemini rules like the mail and email system. So how we get information from one place to another. And so likewise, then Sagittarius, which is across from the moon, is part of this axis. And Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. When we look at it, like if Sagittarius is the natural 8th house or 9th house, then Scorpio is the natural 8th house. And the natural 8th house can be a place of great hardship, ruled by Pluto and Mars. It's kind of the house of, death and rebirth, and that process of having a dark night of the soul and who we are afterwards. And so the 9th house is kind of like, who we emerge as after this process of going to the underworld, after having been wounded in some way, and now Jupiter is a benefic, and it rules very lofty, expanded, exalted themes. And so it's like we're coming into this area of life having been through this very difficult time, going through this deep refinement, and now all of a sudden we are in search of deeper, higher truths. It's very philosophical. I said in an earlier video that I often think of Jupiter like when you picture the old philosophers in Greece, how they used to meet together and have these like oral debates. I like to think of Sagittarius and the 9th house as the town square, where we get together and through our deep experiences that might have involved being exiled or involved in our deep dark nights of the soul sometimes mean that we've been exposed to other cultures. Something broke, there was some type of rupture that happened. And now in the 9th house, we want to have all of this exposure to something new. We want to do the things in our lives that are important and exciting. There's a call to adventure even in Sagittarius. But for the purpose of this axis, I think it's, and given the context of this moment, I think it's really important to see this axis, this one where Gemini rules information, how we get information and media, and Sagittarius ruling higher truths, debate, philosophical outlooks on things, like the philosophy of what is happening. It's really important to look at this axis as an axis of truth seeking, right? For me, that's what's important. If somebody came to me and they had their nodes here, I would be looking at them and their soul journey as one that is particularly concerned with finding deeper or higher truths, sense of like natural righteousness, not dogmatic righteousness, but natural righteousness. And then the capacity to be able to communicate that Gemini down here on the 3D plane, like their soul would be concerned with these things. What's interesting for me is back when the pandemic started, our nodes were in these signs. And if you remember, it felt like digging through a fog of information to find the truth back at that time, because there were so many mistruths. Whether or not those mistruths were intentional or not, I don't know, but it certainly felt like we were in a fog of information. And at that time that the nodes were traveling through this area, they were squaring Neptune. And so Neptune always kind of leaves us in some kind of haze, right? Where we're not sure if what we're dealing with is truth or illusion. And so this axis now, what it feels like to me is from an evolutionary perspective, is with this latest geopolitical crisis that we're in, which started right around the eclipse period, where we had on the 14th of October an eclipse in Libra, and then on the 28th of October, one at the beginning of Taurus, both Venus ruled signs. And eclipses tend to have an effect for at least 6 months, if not more like 18 months, and sometimes even longer. But so we had these two eclipses in Venus ruled signs. Then we had a very powerful new moon, which I called the Tower moment in Scorpio, where we were really seeing the primality of man, in a sense, like our primal, rageful, Kali-like responses, right? That primordial impulse was very prevalent. You could feel it. I had several people tell me as Mercury traveled through Scorpio that they couldn't find words, right? And I felt that as well, as if like I was very deep in my own process. Mercury here is more like a researcher, somebody who's probing at the mystery and is holding its truth very close to its chest. And now Mercury, of course, has moved into Sagittarius. And so we have Mars in Sagittarius conjunct the sun, conjunct Ceres, all in Sagittarius, and that's opposing this full moon. And so this axis of truth is magnifying. And what I think this denotes for us as a collective is this sense that now it's time to really talk about the deeper implications of what we are seeing play out, right? That there has sort of been this way that we've all, or the news and the media, right, has sort of like siloed the narrative in one direction. And there's actually been such a huge snapback to that with all of the like organic protests that we've seen arise. A lot of the protests have been organic. I've looked into like who's funded some of them, and it seems as though not all. So I want to be honest when I'm talking to you. Not all of the protests have been organic in the sense that there have been like bigger philanthropic, right, movements behind some of them funding them. But some of them have been very organic. I know the ones in my town are just springing out of a sense of injustice. The other thing I think is really interesting is that like every chart I've pulled since the eclipses has had a Libra ascendant, which is not normal. So this is like a repeating pattern. It's very interesting. And even the country Israel has a Libra ascendant. And so given that we're, from an evolutionary point, on the cusp of needing to really discuss the deeper philosophical implications for the world and for society, Sagittarius, and potentially in a heated way, Mars, and for what the implications are for children and for women. That's been coming up quite a bit in the collective. So that's Ceres, this Demeter right here, and getting this information out, how it's disseminated, how people are getting access to this information. And right now we've seen that a lot of the pro-Palestine information is coming directly from Gaza to the people on social media without having to go through a mediator, like an editor. And as somebody who comes from a family of journalists, I know to be cautious of that, not because what we're seeing isn't on the whole quite true and honest, but because the job of an editor is supposed to be that they check the facts, right? And so without having that mediary, we always kind of have to take what we're seeing with the smallest grain of salt, that perhaps it's being framed in such a way that we're supposed to draw a specific conclusion, or, you know, it's potentially being, we're just seeing a snippet of something and not the before or the after. And so on the one hand, the direct way of communicating is good. It allows us to see firsthand what's happening. And on the other hand, we do have to keep in mind that it hasn't gone through an honest arbiter, right? Who is sifting through and fact checking for us. Now, on the flip side of that, we have media companies and editors with media companies. In some cases, as Noam Chomsky from a long time ago has taught us, and in my own journalism classes, I know that several of the larger media corporations are owned by conglomerates and they're captured, meaning they're captured and they serve the corporations that they work for. And a lot of those conglomerates, meaning the media company is owned by them, but the conglomerate also owns, let's say, a large stake in the prison industrial complex. And so, you don't report on, let's say, migrants and the migrant crisis at the border because the prison industrial complex is making a lot of money building temporary refugee housing for them, but it's more like prison cells, right? So that's kind of how the media works. So it's like we are really in this precarious moment with our ability to get information and to and how we rely on the information we get, which brings us into some of the deeper questions of what is true and what isn't true. So with all that, so now we're in this moment, right? And the moment is going to denote fiery exchanges of philosophical beliefs, like we're going to begin to debate, like, how is this conflict moving? What are the implications if it keeps going forward? What are some potential with Libra as the rising sign yet again? Libra speaks to us about diplomacy. It's one of the things it speaks to us about. It speaks to us about justice. And so I believe that these themes are going to be part of the larger conversation. It keeps pointing to this, but then again, we've got the nodes here, and the nodal axis lays across Libra and Aries. And one very distilled way we can look at that Libra-Aries axis is war, Aries ruled by Mars, peace, Libra ruled by Venus. And Libra rules diplomacy, justice, harmony, balance, karma. Like balancing the scales of justice is essentially a nod to karma and how nature, kind of abhors a vacuum. And so there's always this sort of balancing act in place. So the first thing I sort of want to really hone in on before then I synthesize all of this information together, or we won't call it the first thing because I've already said several things, but I want to look at the Saturn square, right? We can see that the moon opposing the sun and Mars is squaring Saturn in the beginning of Pisces. And, I was looking at this, I've been looking at this for a while going, what is this about? Like, what is Saturn going to do? So Saturn essentially is this planet of like conservation and tradition, limitation. And I was watching a show. It's a great channel. It's called FormScapes. You can find it on YouTube. And this happened to be about Saturn devouring his kids. And I want to read to you a little bit about, like, from the transcript of that show, what he talks about, because he's talking about war and modern life. And I really love everything that he publishes. He's like a deep philosophical thinker. And I think that's very appropriate to have some philosophical wonderings, let's say, as we are in the sign of Sagittarius. So he says, it's a modernist's desire to use the powers of reason, which are related to Saturn. This idea of like were going to be reasonable, and there was a whole age of reason, right? So he said it's a modernist desire to use the powers of reason to reshape the world. And this eventually devolves into the manifestation of the beast. And let me go on. So he says there's an insatiable will in the modernist to dominate, which was first exemplified by the Roman Empire, and more recently in projects that seek to emulate the power of empire, right? And so that's where I think of like the West and our empire building projects that we're always on, our imperialist projects. So he says our will to remake the world so often reveals itself to be a facade underneath, which we find this will actually wants to devour the world. Like there's a devouring energy in empire. It hides its devouring impulse under the guise of reason. And so this will to devour shows us the horror of ordinary human life being annihilated by the cold, calculative, disciplinary institutions of power and war. And so all of these things have to do with Saturn, right? Saturn squaring this full moon. We're in the midst of this larger project that looks to be, you know, if you look at the kind of sides and how the collective is polarizing, it seems to be like West versus East, indigeneity versus colonizer, right? And so we can see, like, if we were to take the view of the poor Palestinians, let's say, and this is just like one narrative or image that's being projected into the collective for our consideration, right? And there are lots of different narratives about the Palestinians, but one particular narrative is like there's this poor Palestinian who is just trying to live their ordinary life, go to work, go to school. And we see the horror then of this ordinary human being who's being annihilated by the cold, calculative, disciplinary action of the institutions of power and war, and how it is puny in the face of that. And I'd have to say this ordinary human being annihilated by this cold, calculative, and disciplinary institution of power and war is my experience as somebody who's lived in the West Bank. Like, I don't know anybody there who is at all in any way, shape, or form involved in terrorism or hate. Like, these people just want to go to work and go home and take care of their families and live their lives and find as much joy as they possibly can. So this resonates for me personally as being a reality, right? As something that is really happening. And all of these verbs or these words or adjectives, whatever you want to call them, sorry, I think they're adjectives, annihilated, verb, cold, calculative, disciplinary, institution of power, all of those have to do with Saturn. And then, of course, war, Mars. So the institutions that he says that we have created to refashion the world in the image of human rationality, Saturn. So there's these institutions we've created that are refashioning the world in our image. And our image is the rational, reason-based human. It's part of like humanist ideals. And one of the things that I see quite a bit of in the collective is this this way that we are all mapping Western ideals onto the conflict itself, right? So like our way of understanding the experience that Palestinians might be having is through a Western context, right? Our way of understanding indigeneity even is through a Western context. And a lot of that has to do with us being grounded. The West is grounded in the Arthurian myths, right? Like that's our myth. the monomyth. And that myth has to do with the hero's journey, right? And power over and humanistic thought and the will of the individual. Whereas the West is it's still very tribal based and very communal based, and they're still very in touch with their ancestors and cycles versus chronological time. And so it's a mistake in a sense to try and understand what's happening to these two people purely through a Western mapping of things. Like we need to take into consideration, if we're going to try and relate to the Palestinians at all, a more indigenous and Eastern view of the world. They are essentially Asian. They come from the continent of Asia, even though their ancestors migrated from the Western Mediterranean area, they have Eastern values still. And the West was brought to them with the colonization of Israel 75 years ago. So the images that we have seen evoked through this war, and images are something that are related to narratives, images, all of these things that I've been talking about are related to that function of Gemini, that function of like coming to first understand something, being separate, creating our own opinion, getting information and running it through the psyche. These are all Geminian kind of factors, right? And wanting to have lots of different kinds of information. So the images we see evoked, this is what he says, through this war are meant to bring us into a confrontation with reality and the human costs of empire. And I actually think that's right. In this case, he was talking about the French Revolution, but I think it's pertinent in this moment that the images we're seeing evoked in this moment are meant to bring us each into a confrontation with the reality of the human cost of empire and this devouring function of war. And then, so going back to talking about Saturn, because this is part of the video he was making, was kind of talking about the Saturnine archetype. Saturn is known in Greek myth as Kronos, the god of time. And so we must understand that our modern understanding of time itself doesn't necessarily accord with the concept of time denoted by other concepts of time, meaning there's more than one concept of time. So in modernity, we understand time in a few different ways. The first is Kairos or Kairos time. And this indicates when a decisive or opportune moment has come along. And I know you all know what I'm talking about. I don't need to give you an example. It's like a magical moment when all things collided and the opportunity arose, right? Or there's a thing called ionic time or an aeon, and this denotes cosmic, cyclical, or eternally returning time. And so, and then Chronos is like chronic time that moves in a chronic progression forward. And we in the West mostly adhere to this chronological time. And so what of that? What then of Kronos time? So the Roman philosopher Cicero wrote that the Latin name for Kronos was Saturn because time became saturated as it came to devour the ages. Just as Kronos himself devoured his children, Saturn did devour his children in the myth. And so for the ancients, Kronos was the all-consuming past, with all things eventually coming to be devoured and thus incorporated into history itself. And there is something to be said about the echo of history inside this current conflict. So we've got this kind of grappling with the truth axis with the sun and moon across Gemini, Sagittarius, and then this injection of tradition, conservation, history, like this sense of again and again being brought to this precipice of time meeting us here and asking us, how will we respond now? Is it going to be the same pattern we've repeated again and again that helped has helped empire devour more and more people, or will it finally be a different response? In order for evolution to happen, the response has to be different. So insofar as Kronos represents the past, it also represents the inertia of the past and the human institutions which carry the legacy of the past forward into the future. And those institutions, remember, are cold and calculating and disciplinary, and they impose their will on ordinary human life. So this inertia is always acting upon us. So Kronos is father time. And this paternal denotation of father time seems to be a gesture towards the patriarchal structure of families, tribes, and kingdoms, which serve to carry forward the momentum of these traditions and institutions. And again, we can see this playing out in the conflict in the Middle East. We've got tribes, kingdoms, right? All of this stuff. And they're bringing forward these clashes of traditions, which is one narrative or image for us to consider as part of this conflict. In alchemy, Saturn's associated with the substance of lead, which is indicates like a mass, something heavy, something weighty, and of course, inertia, gravity. Lead is very heavy. So moving from Saturn to this square he's making with the full moon, we should also then look at the concept of egregore, which refers to a kind of collective consciousness which arises from the thought and activity of a distinct group of people. Because, like we said, there's family, tribe, which is collective, right? Our collective societies, kingdoms, and each of those is going to have an egregore. And for me, this is absolutely the most distinct part of this whole conflict, the part that interests me the most. And it's very much a, let's see, merging of the energy when we look at Saturn squaring Sagittarius. So it's sort of like, you know, how the ideologies are born out of certain philosophies, and underneath all of this, there are ideological underpinning. So like Zionism in and of itself is an actual ideology. Like it was born a little more than 100 years ago. It's a specific ideal, and it is pinned in place, crystallized Saturn thought forms pinned in place that are clashing with what I personally would call reality. Like the reason I think there's been nonstop conflict here is because Zionism is built on this idea that says people without a land for a land without a people, which is a belief, but not an actual reality, right? And the reality was there was a well-established culture and people in Palestine. And so now we're beginning to look at egregores and how people tell their stories, and then how those thought forms then get embedded into society. And when we begin to have philosophical debate, how polluted the debate can be when we aren't in reality. Like another thing that I think is kind of like an unreality that's becoming an egregore, not on the Zionist side, but on the Palestinian side, is that Hamas is just freedom fighters, right? And that they're not connected to any terror groups. And that's another unreality. And trying to rewrite that in a way that, I mean, they are a government group that has ruled over this specific piece of land, but their action on October 7th was terrorism. They killed civilians, innocent civilians that were going about their day. And it is a bizarre egregore to try and rewrite that. So if you have these two sides, Zionism that is related, it is rooted in a rewritten history that says it somehow was not a colonial venture when it clearly was, given the words of the early Zionists. They all called what they were doing colonialism. I think it would still be called colonialism. I know it would be, because that's what it is in reality, if colonialism hadn't fallen out of favor. So there's this sort of like attempt to rewrite what's happening there and why they're there, and to embed that not only in the psyche of the Israelis, but in the psyche of the people that support them. They have propaganda, wild propaganda, not wild, wildly big propaganda campaigns with inertia, right? Trying to recruit people into their specific narrative. And likewise with the Palestinians, it's like, I'm watching this in real time happen, where we're trying to sort of rewrite what Hamas is. And I mean, I could see Hamas as freedom fighters if all they wanted to do was liberate the Palestinian people and hold elections, right? And then democratically allow whoever wins the election to come to power and allow anybody to run. But that's not what Hamas wants to do. Hamas wants to win freedom for the Palestinians. Yes, they want a two-state solution, but then they also want to be in power, So that's, to me, that there's something that's not aligned there. And so to rewrite them as just freedom fighters is a kind of egregore if that catches on. And then people are debating with, this other side that's very pro-Zionist. It's like you've got these two thought forms as stand-ins for reality, which is a problem. And hopefully part of what this full moon will do is to help balance out since this is the axis of truth, hopefully what this full moon can do is to help us peel back some of these layers of egregore and be in reality, because reality is where you can actually really see how peace is very possible. It's the opposing ideologies that are exclusionary and make peace impossible. So as soon as you start weeding out the untruth from both of the narratives, you're like, oh, I see how we could live here together in harmony and peace. And wars could end, and it's actually possible. But it is not possible when you're hooked by an egregore. So let's look at what he has to say. So he says, one could understand this concept as a kind of hyper agency which transcends individual human beings. It is the will of the tribe or the mob state or the corporation or institutions and the collective consciousness which emerges from them. That's egregore. So it's like this hyper agency. It's bigger than one person, which transcends the individual, bigger than one person. And then it becomes the will of the mob, the state, the corporation, the institution, and the collective consciousness. And this emerges from and very much embodies this. This is egregore, this kind of archetype. And so we see the Zionism as an archetype, and freedom fighter and, justice as an archetype. And so this egregore carries forward the spirit of the collective and comes to incorporate or consume the individuals who participate in them. And have you found that for yourself? Like if you're talking to somebody who's staunchly Zionist or staunchly pro-Palestinian, that they are absolutely consumed by, I can't have conversations with people who are hooked into these ideologies. I can't. There is no talking to them. They are consumed by an egregore, by like a mind virus, and it does not allow them to dialogue with you. All it allows for is the recitation of the egregore again and again. And each egregore is meant to be this like cyclical jumble of words that just brings you back to no starting point. And so, sorry, it consumes the individuals who participate them in the best of circumstances, and such collective institutions serve to sustain and further perpetuate human life. I feel like I didn't write this very well. Perpetuate human life, the practices and collective spirit embodied by the egregore are able to form a collective agency which allows for the egregore of individual. I think I didn't write this very well. I'm sorry. I'm going to just try and say it without reading it. And I did. I don't even understand what I wrote there. Sorry. So essentially what we need to understand is that the egregore consumes people, and it doesn't really allow them to go, like to be sovereign, to be individuals. And so yeah, I want to say a few other things about this chart. Let me see, I've got this down here. So what we've seen is there's been this polarization, right? And some of the larger themes are this East versus West. We've got people who are embedded in collective thought forms. They're invested in collective thought forms. They're not talking to each other well. And then you've got people who are not. You've got people who can look very rationally, Saturn, right, at this conflict and sort of see the historical context and how each side has contributed to factors on the ground being what they are. And like I said, for the people who aren't embedded in either ideology, who aren't hooked by it, these people, like the Libra rising, can be the people who are the peacemakers, can be the people who are who help to bring about a resolution. You know, I really do see some of the narrative that comes up on the pro-Palestinian side. It's very social justice, right? And for me, I feel like I'm sort of allergic to a lot of that stuff because it feels so thought for me. And then underneath that, there really is this coalition who's been working for Palestinian justice for years and years and years and years. And it embeds us in our own history in the sense of post-West 9/11 and how we all kind of got swept into that egregore, you know, that kind of, you know, we had the boogeymen of terrorism, and how that really served as a cover for our ecological and economical, right, oil adventuring in the West. It gave us the boogeyman that we needed to justify the deaths of all of these Iraqis. And so it's kind of like, it feels like a sort of reckoning for people in the West. Like either we continue to feed this boogeyman of the Islamic extremism and everything that we do, no matter how harmful, no matter how unjust, the extrajudicial killings, I mean, all of it, the warmongering, the price tag of it all, like the literal price tag. And it's all justified because the boogeyman of the terrorist is that bad. Or we really need to look at this and look at the justifications that were being given, and Libra, if those are actually just. And Libra making her conjunction, or sorry, Venus making her conjunction to the South Node is asking us that question. It's essentially looking at, like, is there balance inside this narrative? is there balance inside what we're being fed as justification? Justification is the root word of justification is justice. Is there actual justice inside of this? Like, remember, we went into Iraq because we were told there were WMDs there, and that turned out we had no business being in Iraq, period. Even if Saddam was a bad guy, like, we didn't have any business there. And hundreds of thousands of civilians died in this campaign. And so we've got to start as Americans, even if we have no ties to that area, asking if what we are doing and this trajectory, demonizing the Middle East and demonizing people who are Islamic, if this is sustainable and if it's just, and if there is karma that's potentially going to come back on us. Because look at this, Saturn's at the first degree of Pisces. So technically he's trining, he's connecting to the South Node in Libra where he's exalted. And this speaks to us about fate and karma. He's the lord of karma in Vedic astrology. The South Node speaks to us about fate. The ascendant speaks to us about the subject of the chart. Like, what is this chart really about? Like, what is this all in service to? All of this grappling with the truth and debating and really looking at the philosophical validity and, you know, having the larger town square debate and unhooking from egregore and ideology. Like, what's the reason we're doing all of that? And what this chart tells us is we're doing it in service to living a just life and not accumulating more karma for ourselves and for the country we live in. And I'll tell you, with Pluto at the, you know, at the end degree of Capricorn in his USA return area, this is a heavily karmic moment for us. And if the subject is East versus West, it's not looking good if we don't create a third way. If we continue to polarize along the same lines we've been polarizing along, having the same winners in the same devouring aspect, it's not looking good. We've got to actually look at what's going on here and respond not from an ideological standpoint, not from a like, oh, well, it benefits the military industrial complex, so we're just going to keep doing it, or economically it makes sense because we make money and it boosts the economy when there's war. But like, actually look at a third way. Like, how can this area be served justice so this particular issue stops cropping up? And I believe that, you know, it has served the East to have the boogeyman of the West, you know, the evil colonizer, the evil imperialist. And so they get their boogeyman and we get our boogeyman and the terrorist, and, you know, the religious Islamic extremisms. We both have this boogeyman and the East versus the West, and we can kind of like continue to distract ourselves with these villains versus look at the real issues we are all facing, whether it's at home or geopolitically and abroad. And so this chart, what it tells me is it's time to get to work. It's time to look at the truth. It's time to unhook ourselves from narratives. It's time to take responsibility, Saturn, if we need to take responsibility. And it's time to center justness. I don't want to use the word justice because I feel it's been so co-opted by certain groups. It's time to look at just what is just. What is just for the Israelis? What is just for the Palestinians? Let's have a just answer here. And let's finally close this situation that is exacerbating everything. It is the focal point, the seed point of the East versus West conflict. And we're going to accumulate karma that we do not want. That's what this chart says. And with the USA Pluto return happening right now, we are either at a place where we can strengthen America and strengthen our place in the world and reaffirm ourselves as the moral and just superpower that we used to be, or we're going to see our decline. Period. That's it. That's what this chart says, and it says it very clearly. So thank you for being with me as we looked at this chart. I know that the themes that we've been dealing with recently have been feeling very heavy, although I am very hopeful. I am hopeful that for each of you who listens to this chart or this transmission and is able to go in and look like, is this thing that I believe, is this ideological? Is the media feeding me a line here? Do they want me to invest in their narrative? Or am I following a thread of truth that is just really true, right? Or am I investing in boogeyman and archetypal images that are being placed there for me to get scared or for me to have a specific reaction? This is psychological warfare, no doubt about it. And that's what Gemini and Sagittarius is highlighting in terms of it being the axis of truth. Like it highlights where we are fed specific information so that we come to predetermined conclusions, right? And how Aries Libra, Aries being the sovereign, how we can actually come back into the presence of I am that isn't connected to anything larger, and be with our own truth that is just and karmically, one of the things that Libra is about is the heart weighing less than a feather, and this kind of idea of purity, and not purity in the way that it's been heavily connotated in the West in a way that is not helpful, but purity in purity in heart, purity in mind, purity in that my intentions are good, they're clean, they're pure, and they're bent towards justness. They're bent towards evolution, not devolution. If we don't make a different choice at this juncture, if history repeats itself yet again with the, sorry to say it, with the weaker people being devoured by empire, I do worry from a karmic, cosmic level about the future of our country. We've got to find a third way. And it doesn't mean we lose. It's just a way where more people than just us can win. If that makes sense. Okay, loves. I'll talk to you soon. This was a good transmission.